What really shapes the mindset of a terrorist? Well, today we're going to jump into one very specific and really detailed perspective on that question. We're breaking down the core arguments from the book, Journey into the Mind of an Islamic Terrorist.
So this entire explainer is based on this one book from 2006. It was written by Dr. Mark A. Gabriel, who identifies himself as a former professor of Islamic history at the famous Al-Azhar University in Cairo. We're going to explore the framework he presents, pulled directly from these pages. So what makes someone write a book like this? You might think he'd start with politics or some grand theory, but that's not what he does. He starts somewhere way more personal, with a story about his best friend. And this is the sentence that really hooks you right from the start. The author grounds his entire argument in a personal story, pulling you immediately into his own experience with this one powerful line. This story about his friend Kamal isn't just a side note, it's really the emotional engine for the book's whole introduction. The author basically presents the tragedy of watching his friend's life get consumed and ultimately destroyed by radicalism as the very reason he felt he had to find some answers. So, how does the author build from that very personal beginning? Well, right at the start of the book, he's super careful to set the stage, defining exactly what he's going to analyze and, just as importantly, what he's not. Okay, so before he gets into his main points, the author lays out some really clear ground rules. He writes that this is not an expression of hate, but an expression of love for Muslim people. He stresses that he's talking about a tiny, tiny percentage of people who are radical, and that his whole goal is to arm citizens with information, not to give them a license to insult or dehumanize anyone. And this is maybe the most crucial point. The book isn't a catalog of what radicals do. The author really wants to shift our focus to why they do it. He frames his entire work as an investigation into the core motivations that drive individuals down that path. And to answer that why, he makes a very specific choice. Now, he acknowledges things like political, economic, and social motives, but he chooses to focus almost entirely on the religious factor, which he argues is the most powerful and misunderstood part of the whole puzzle. And you really can't ignore the context here. This was written back in 2006. I mean, the dedication page itself mentions figures like George W. Bush and Tony Blair, the coalition militaries in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it explicitly references the war against Islamic terrorism. It really puts the work firmly in that specific moment in history. All right, so with all that context set, how does the author actually build his case? Well, he provides a really clear and methodical roadmap for us to follow. The book is basically broken down into 6 main parts. It kicks off with his personal story, then kind of zooms out to trace the history of modern radicalism. After that, he presents his central theory, what he calls the 5 pillars. Then he analyzes strategy, reviews historical precedents, and finally, he wraps it all up by proposing a path toward peace. And this right here, this brings us to the real heart of the author's original argument. He synthesizes a whole range of radical writings into a single framework he calls the 5 pillars of radical Islamic philosophy. All right, so here they are. According to the author, these are the 5 core concepts. First, no law but Islamic law, meaning any man-made government is seen as illegitimate. Second, infidels are all around, dividing the world into believers and non-believers. Third, Islam must rule, the ultimate geopolitical goal. Fourth, jihad is the only way to win, arguing that holy war is the only tool to achieve that role. And finally, number 5, faith is the reason, the ultimate justification that transcends any other logic. Okay, so after laying out this pretty stark analysis, the book takes a really interesting turn. In its final section, it shifts from just diagnosing the problem to actually proposing a solution. So in the book's final act, the author delivers a message you might not expect. Optimism. Yep. Despite the bleak picture he's just painted, he makes it very clear that he does not believe the situation is hopeless. And to back this up, he points to specific historical events he calls signs of hope. He cites the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt adopting a policy of nonviolence, and another group, Al-Jamala Islamiyah, declaring a ceasefire back in 1997. He holds these up as real-world proof that ideologies and tactics can and do change. And this all circles back to his original mission for writing the book in the first place. He concludes that his ultimate purpose is to provide information that can help the world create the best strategy possible for achieving peace. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. We've just walked through one author's very specific, very detailed framework for understanding a global issue. So the question to consider is this: How does analyzing a single, deep perspective like this one help us better grasp the larger, incredibly complex issues facing the world?